All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's seminar. My name is Patrick, your host for this evening. I'm the VP for Counseling for HS2 Academy. And so tonight we are going to be going over what are called the Ivy Plus colleges, which are a little distinct from the more familiar Ivy League colleges. Although once we start taking a look at the names of some of these colleges, I'm pretty sure you're going to be familiar with most, if not all of them. And I just wanted to go through a little bit more nuanced information about these colleges, how they select students, what they're known for, and maybe a little bit more insights or tidbits into each of these really top universities. Okay, so without further ado, let's get started. So what is an Ivy Plus college or university? Well, most of you are familiar with the Ivy League, right? So these are the top schools like Harvard, Princeton, and Yale. I think most people assume that all top colleges are somehow Ivy League schools, though, and that's not necessarily the case. The Ivy League are a very set group of only 8 colleges, which include, like I said, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, UPenn, Columbia, Cornell, Dartmouth, and Brown. Right. And the one common thread of all those colleges is that they are all part of a sports league, right? It's an athletic conference, much like the Pac-10, the Big 10, Big 12, the ACC, et cetera. Okay. Now, you're probably already familiar with some of these schools that I'm going to mention here. Schools like MIT, Stanford, Duke, and Johns Hopkins, while commonly within that top 10, are actually not part of the Ivy League. Okay. Even though they really are, academically speaking, on par with those same universities. If you were to look at like the stats of the students who are getting in, if you were to look at the acceptance rates of these universities, they're pretty much on par, right? And in some cases, they're actually even better than some of the Ivy League schools in terms of certain fields or majors, right? So which we'll take a look at. Okay, now there's not a clear-cut definition, though, in terms of what's an Ivy Plus and what's not. Some will include like the core 7, which is what I'm going to cover today. Some will include other schools like Rice or Vanderbilt among the list of colleges. So that might be a little bit more of an expansive list. And I didn't want to really cover as much as those lists do because not everybody agrees. But I think it's fair to say that the schools I will be covering in this, it's widely considered, or they're all widely considered part of this like Ivy Plus categorization. Okay. All right, so let's get started. So the list of schools that I'm going to classify today as Ivy Plus include MIT, and these rankings are using US News and World Report, which is now number 2, Stanford, which is currently number 3, Duke and Caltech, which are both tied for number 7 at the moment, Johns Hopkins and Northwestern, both tied for number 9, and the University of Chicago, which is now number 12, okay? All right, so let's dive deep into what these colleges have in common here. So first of all, let's take a look at the acceptance rates of these colleges. Like I said, these are all very selective schools, right? So if you were to take a look at the most recent acceptance rates, note, by the way, that for a few of them, the 2028 acceptance rates, or the class of 2028, which is the college graduating year, is not available yet, which would have been like last year's seniors, basically, right? So as you can see, they've more or less stayed kind of similar. There's a little bit of kind of like up and down going here. MIT is kind of hovering around that like 4% average. Stanford actually went up a little bit 2 years ago. We don't know yet what it's going to look like this year until they release their statistics. Caltech is probably the lowest of the bunch. You're hovering at around like an average around 3% these days, right? So Caltech is very, very selective. But some of these other schools, they are getting slightly more competitive. Duke has dropped down from about 6% to about 5% last year. Similarly with Johns Hopkins, from around 7-ish% to about 6%, so getting more and more competitive. Northwestern actually bumped up a little bit, interestingly, right? But not by much, right? Not enough. So it's still around that like lower 7% acceptance rate. And University of Chicago already has been fairly competitive the last few years. Now, all in all, this is really about the same as the acceptance rates for the top Ivies. Like you'd get Harvard, Princeton, and Yale probably around the 3 or 4% acceptance rate. Some of the other Ivies like Brown, UPenn, for example, or Dartmouth will probably be closer to like the 7 or 8% acceptance rate. So if you were to stack them top to bottom, these 7 Ivy Plus schools are going to be very, very competitive and very, very similar in terms of the acceptance rates to the 8 actual Ivy League schools. Okay. So, the name Ivy Plus is actually a fair description because it takes into account just how competitive these schools are in comparison to the traditional Ivy League schools. All right, so we can also take a look at the difference between early action and early decision versus the overall rates. So the reason why I decided to bold MIT and Caltech here is that for many years, both MIT and Caltech have been very public about the fact that they make no distinction, I guess, or they don't do anything to favor applicants in the early round. So they more or less consider them the same way. And these numbers sort of bear them out. Like you'll see that it's slightly higher, but that's more of sort of like an accident of like just, I guess a little bit more of the self-selection of the pool perhaps, right? But in many years, it was actually the same. So I think there was just like a slight uptick in prior years here or in this year. Right. So UChicago is an interesting one because they do have both ED2, ED and ED2, and they also have an EA. They haven't really published their early acceptance rates for quite a few years now, like 2 or 3 years now. One thing about UChicago, though, that you should note is that they recently added a program where if you attended one of their pre-college summer programs, you're actually allowed to apply to them even before the EA application deadline and get a decision from them within 3 weeks, which is kind of a nice like little twist to it. I'm a little concerned though if that trend becomes more common, because then that would mean that if other colleges do it, it sort of adds a little bit more incentive to do your summer programs at that university. And normally summer pre-colleges are not cheap, especially if they're, from a top university like this. It's going to run into the several thousands kind of like budget for these things. But nonetheless, if UChicago is your dream school, this could be a really good opportunity for you to apply and then hear even before the EAED rounds are due. Okay, so that could be a good opportunity specifically for students who did attend their summer pre-college. Okay, now for other schools, the biggest boost that you're going to see in these schools are from the ones that have early decision, right? So Duke, Johns Hopkins, Northwestern, and UChicago do have early decision. And what you can see here, if you were to compare the rates, Duke, it's more than double. Same thing with Johns Hopkins. And for Northwestern, it's pretty much like triple of the acceptance rate, right? Like I said, we don't know about UChicago, right? But interestingly here, Stanford and Caltech both have something called REA, which stands for Restricted Early Action, which means you can only apply to them for early action. Now, there are a couple of like loophole situations. They do allow you to apply to public universities, and this isn't going to be the case for all of them. You can apply to public universities for EA with no restriction. And for many of these schools, or for Caltech and Stanford, they do allow you to apply to USC. So USC has a popular EA option that they make you apply EA if you want to be considered for merit scholarships. And so thankfully, both Stanford and Caltech have made it policy that they do allow you to go ahead and apply to where they allow you to apply simultaneously both themselves and to USC for EA, okay? Just because they don't want to necessarily have someone forfeit their chance to be considered for merit scholarships to USC, okay? All right, so let's move on. So a little bit about the admissions process for these top level Ivy Plus schools. I'll give you an example here of MIT. So MIT uses what's called a committee approach or a committee system, right? So the way they do this is that they will have a couple of senior admissions officers evaluate each file individually. Okay, so unlike other schools, MIT doesn't really sort by region, or they don't give any sort of preferences for things like legacy status, right? So they will largely classify students into 3 main piles, and they're very distinct here, which is almost certainly not, almost certainly yes, and qualified, but we'll see. So the phrasings are kind of interesting for Caltech because they do leave a little bit of like leeway there. It's not like reject, accept, or maybe, right? Which is what some schools might do, okay? Phase 2, additional admissions officers evaluate each student file, giving their own ratings. And then it moves on to an admissions committee phase where they discuss each applicant in detail, right? So very similar to what I saw in Harvard when I was there in their grad school admissions office. It's a very democratic process where they really just kind of like have the entire staff evaluate when it comes down to those really crucial final cuts, okay? So once they're done with that, they will then make decisions on whether a student is admitted, denied admission, or either deferred if they're in the early round or waitlisted if it's in the regular round. Okay, just to give you a little bit of a sense in terms of how they approach this process. Okay. Now, so what kind of credentials do you need to be competitive for an Ivy Plus level school? Okay. So of course, the first one is rigorous coursework, right? They expect students to be able to take the most challenging available AP or IB courses or honors courses at their high school. And ideally, I mean, you really want to try to get straight A's as best as possible to be a competitive candidate for those schools. But in general, if you have maybe one, maybe two B's at most, you could still be in the mix. Although, of course, that would put a little bit more pressure on the rest of your application, right, to make up for the fact that you don't necessarily have straight A's. Okay. All right. Now, in some rare cases, there have been students who did get into this caliber of schools with maybe 3, 4, or 5 B's, but oftentimes there's maybe a really compelling story about their personal or family background, or perhaps they have like an overriding talent or ability that the school is interested in terms of recruiting. Okay. As far as the extracurricular profile, top students will often have exceptional accomplishments, such as a high caliber research or publications, school leadership, long track record of school or community service, and accolades in various activities such as sports, music, or other competitive activities, normally at the very least, like the statewide level, preferably in the national or even in some cases, the international level. That's how competitive these schools are. Now, as far as standardized testing, so this has kind of come back in the public conversation because now actually both MIT and Caltech now require SAT or ACT again, which is kind of interesting because MIT did start requiring SAT even as early as like 2 or 3 years ago. But Caltech, since the beginning of the pandemic up to just last year, they were actually the polar opposite. They were like the UC system, the University of California system. They were actually test blind. They didn't even look at the testing. But then they realized all of a sudden that, yeah, you know what, it kind of helps to have these tests to be able to kind of make their decisions in terms of who deserves to get in. So when we're looking at the numbers that you need to be qualified, these universities will often report not an average per se. It's not going to be down the middle an average, what you would find to be like the 50th percentile, but they report it in terms of percentile scores. They report the 25th percentile, which means of the students who got in, this score, the 25th percentile, will represent the bottom 25%, okay? And the 75th percentile will reflect the top 25%, okay? Now, oftentimes, many of the students that we work with at HS2 do happen to be Asian, right? And so it's been a known fact for a long time that Asians do tend to score higher. This is not a stereotype. This is actually a proven fact by statistics by just both College Board and the ACT themselves. So if you are Asian and you're applying to these schools, I would say the quote unquote Asian average will be the 75th percentile scores. So in other words, these are the scores that you want to be competitive. So with the exception of both Caltech and MIT, which are very, very numerically oriented, as you'll note here, which they require pretty much, or they're targeting like a perfect 36, right? All these other schools are looking more at like a 35 to be in the top 25%, okay? Now for SAT scores, I mean, it's pretty similar. You're looking at like a 1560 or 1570 there, right? So across the board, very, very competitive scores. Now, I will note, though, that because the Caltech didn't actually have these reported scores over the last 3 or 4 years, these are using their data back from 2019, 2020, right? Which was the last year that they actually accepted or required the SAT because, starting with COVID, they didn't require it, like I mentioned, okay? All right. So what else can you do? How can you strengthen your profile to make yourself competitive for this level of schools? Well, the first one is to channel your energies or activities into the ones that you're most passionate about and talented in, so that you can be ideally regionally or even nationally competitive by the time you apply. So for many of these schools, it's not really how many activities that you want, that you have. It's really how high or how impressive can you be in those said activities. Now, especially in the case of Caltech and MIT, that's going to skew more heavily towards the STEM field, right? They really want, their philosophy is they really want the best of the best in terms of STEM, right? So students who've shown exceptional talent or accomplishment in various fields like engineering or computer science or mathematics, those are the ones who are going to be most interesting to and attractive to Caltech and MIT, right? So these other schools, it's maybe a broader categorization. They're not necessarily as STEM centric as MIT and Caltech are, right? But in general, what these schools are looking for, they're looking for evidence of such things as love of learning and genuine passion. So if you were to strive to demonstrate these in your activities and your essays, then of course you will be able to kind of enhance your chances of being more competitive, or at least standing out from the general applicant pool, okay? These Ivy Plus level schools are certainly looking for top shelf intellectuals, right? So they really want more than just the hardworking grinder sort is I guess the stereotype that they have, right? So if you're just getting A's and you work hard, but you don't really show a lot of enthusiasm for the subject matter, your teachers say you're just quiet and you don't really talk in class, it makes it harder for you, right? So I'll be honest, you definitely need to be able to get good recommendation letters. You need to be able to show passion for your subject matter, well beyond just the normal, just grades and standardized testing, right? That's a prerequisite, of course. You do have to have those good scores there, but you do need to do a little bit more than just having those numbers, okay? Next. So let's compare, let's take a look. I'm going to give you a tour basically of all these different schools so you have a sense in terms of what they're good at. We will start with MIT, so Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which is in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It's really not all that far from Harvard. I actually did end up going to MIT a couple of times when I was doing my master's program at Harvard, right? So a couple of key things here. MIT is outstanding in a lot of different fields. They're ranked #2 overall by US News and World Report. They also have the #1 best undergraduate engineering program, tied with a couple of other schools, right? They have the #2 best business program, which is, I think, of a little bit of a shocker to some people because its reputation for, I guess, engineering sort of overshadows it. But they're also really quite outstanding, both in undergraduate business and in their MBA program, right? Not surprisingly, they're #1 in computer science. They're #1 tied in econ as well, right? So for business and econ, it skews more towards the quantitative fields, I guess, more like finance and stuff, right? So other fields, surprisingly, they're also really good at natural sciences like biology and chemistry, right? And not surprisingly, #1 in math and physics. So MIT across the board is an outstanding institution, especially if you're interested in doing research, right? Very, very strong research university. All right, some facts about them, right? So they were founded back in 1861. So although a little bit of a baby compared to Harvard, Harvard was founded in the 1600s, right? By the Commonwealth of Massachusetts for scientific and technical training. From its inception, it was meant to be a tech institute, right? It does have a reputation for grade deflation. What that means is that unlike some other institutions where once you go there, they rarely, if ever, will give students B's, C's, or D's, right? Many students will have an easier time getting A's for some top universities. MIT really prides itself on not necessarily letting the undergraduates off too easy, right? So it does have a reputation of being a place where it's hard to get good grades, okay? In fact, one of our counselors actually had a little anecdote. So our counselor had graduated from MIT, and one of his friends decided to ask one of their academic advisors about like, oh, do they have some tips in terms of how to get a better GPA? And I kid you not, this is going to, I guess, verge into our next point here. They actually recommended that that student take advantage of MIT's very generous cross-registration policy with Harvard, right? So both Harvard and MIT have this policy where you can take up to half of your classes each semester at each other's institution, right? So I guess because Harvard has grade inflation versus MIT's grade deflation, some MIT students will take a couple of their just general graduation, like GE courses, right? General electives, I guess, or general education requirements at Harvard, just because it's slightly easier than the MIT version, right? MIT has also had a very long-standing rivalry with Caltech, right? And students from each campus try to outdo each other with very elaborate, ingenious, and, to be honest, borderline illegal pranks, right? There was one year, for instance, where when Caltech students went over to MIT, which has a giant dome-shaped building, and they painted the dome in the colors of and the patterns of R2-D2, right? So R2-D2 has a very like domish head, I guess, if you will, if you watched Star Wars before. And MIT, not to be outdone, actually drove students all the way to California, and they actually kidnapped, I guess, or hijacked the cannon that was displayed in MIT's yard, right? So, I mean, that's just to give you a sampling, right? Like a little bit of hijinks and shenanigans by students of both schools, right? Also, a little bit of a fun fact here, MIT doesn't actually have names for its buildings. They're all numbered, right? Which kind of goes a long way to show a little bit of the philosophy of the school itself. Yes, it's very STEM-centric. Numbers are a big part of the campus culture at MIT, okay? Next up, we have Stanford University in sunny Palo Alto, California, right? So gorgeous campus, very kind of like Spanish architecture. It's, widely considered one of, the more beautiful campuses across America. So in terms of its rankings, right? So Stanford is ranked number 3 overall, right? And it kind of sometimes skips around, it's usually in that 1 to 5 range, right? As the number 2 best undergraduate engineering program, number 1 best in business for the MBA program. I'm pretty sure that Stanford doesn't actually have an undergraduate business. You'd have to major in econ, right? But they do have for graduate school, the number 1 MBA program, right? They're number 2 in computer science. They're number 1 tied with MIT, I guess, in economics. And they're also number 1 in a lot of different fields. They have the number 1 ranked law school this year, number 1 political science, mathematics, physics, psychology, which is kind of why, I mean, a lot of people do feel like in terms of just national reputation, like Stanford's really up there with like Harvard in terms of just being the most well-rounded top universities, okay? Next, a couple of details and facts about Stanford, right? Stanford was founded in 1884 by the famous railroad tycoon Leland Stanford, right? Who, apart from making millions of dollars, with his like railroad business, was also a California senator at the time that he founded Stanford, and also the former governor of California. Technically, its legal name is Leland Stanford Junior University, although I'm not really sure why it would still be called a junior university, because there's nothing in common with things like a junior college or community college, okay? Unlike the Ivy, Stanford does offer scholarships to recruited athletes. That's definitely something that not a lot of people know, is that the Ivy League schools are prohibited by common agreement, right? They're not allowed to give out both merit or athletic scholarships, right? So that's kind of why Stanford is oftentimes a very attractive place to go to. If you're really good for sport and you want to try to get a scholarship, and you're also obviously really kind of competitive academically, right? Stanford athletes have also won medals in every single Olympic Games, right? This one included, right? So even though Stanford has one of the lowest acceptance rates, they're unique among top private schools not evaluating freshman year grades, okay? So that's one of the key things that makes them unique. Stanford also has a unique tradition during freshman orientation of fountain hopping, splashing around the fountain on campus during a day of mayhem. Again, I guess I duplicated that last one. All right, so next up we have